Have you ever heard sentences like, you ought to study more, we ought to respect our parents, and wondered, is ought to a rule? Is it advice? Is it compulsory or optional? Today, we are going to learn everything about ought to, its meaning, rules, sentence structures, examples, common mistakes, comparison with should and must. By the end of this video, you will use ought to confidently like a native speaker. So let's begin. Ought to is a modal verb expression used to talk about moral duty, advice, responsibility, and what is right or expected. It tells us what is the correct or ideal thing to do, not always compulsory, but morally important. Ought to means should, but with strong moral responsibility. Basic structure of ought to. Subject plus ought to plus base verb. Please don't add s and ing at the end of the base verb, and there should be no past form after to. Now let us see some examples. You ought to help the poor. Students ought to respect teachers. We ought to follow traffic rules. Now let us see some incorrect examples. You ought to helps. Here s should not be added to the base verb help. Now let us see another incorrect example. She ought to helping. Here ing should not be added to the base verb help. Ought to is used for moral duty. This is the most common use. When something is morally right, we use ought to. Now let us see some examples. We ought to speak the truth. Children ought to obey their parents. People ought to care for the environment. These are not laws, but moral responsibilities. If your heart says it's right, use ought to. Ought to is used to give strong advice. Now let us see some examples. You ought to exercise daily. He ought to stop smoking. She ought to save money. Now let us see the difference between should and ought to. Should is used to give normal advice. Ought to is used to give advice with responsibility. When something is expected to happen, we use ought to. Now let us see some examples. The train ought to arrive on time. This phone ought to work properly. The movie ought to be interesting. Please do remember that this is just an expectation, but not guarantee. Now let us know the structure of negative form of ought to. Subject plus ought not to plus base verb. In British English, ought not to is pronounced as oughtn't to. Now let us see some examples. You ought not to lie. We ought not to waste water. He oughtn't to be rude. Ought not to is used to say what is wrong and unacceptable. Now let us know the structure of question form of ought to. Ought plus subject plus to plus base verb. Now let us see some examples. Ought I to apologize? Ought we to follow this rule? Ought he to tell the truth? Please do remember the question form of ought to is mostly used in formal English. Now let us know how to use ought to express the things which happened in the past. This is very important for exams and real English. Now let us know its structure. Subject plus ought to have plus past participle. That is third form of the verb. It is used when something should have been done but was not done. Now let us see some examples. I ought to have studied harder. He ought to have helped you. We ought to have arrived earlier. In all these sentences, ought to expresses regret plus missed responsibility. Now let us see some common mistakes which we make while using ought to. I ought to went home. This is the wrong one. The correct one is I ought to go home. She ought go. This is the wrong one. The correct one is she ought to go. Now let us know when to use ought to, should and must. Must is used to express strong obligation. Ought to is used to express moral duty and strong advice. Should is used to express general advice. Now let us see some examples. You must wear a helmet. You ought to respect elders. You should drink water. Now let us see daily life examples. We ought to be honest in life. Leaders ought to think about people. Students ought to focus on skills. Humans ought to protect nature. Now let's have a quick practice. You dash respect your parents. The answer is ought to. That is, you ought to respect your parents. Now let us see another sentence. We dash waste food. The answer is ought not to. That is, we ought not to waste food. Now let us see another sentence. I dash have listened to my teacher. The answer is ought to. That is, I ought to have listened to my teacher. If you understand ought to clearly, like this video, share it with your friends, comment one sentence using ought to, and don't forget to subscribe for more easy English grammar lessons. Remember, good English is not talent, it's practice. You ought to practice every day. See you in the next video.